Dr. Robert A. Hunt, born in Dallas, Texas,
Hi.
earned his BA in history from University of Texas at Austin and a Master of Theology from the best school in Texas, Perkins School of Theology, where he is also an esteemed professor and teaches a variety of courses on um, mission and global theological education and interreligious dialogue, and also has just a litany of other awards that you can look up on his CV. And lately has been immersed in the world of AI and how that relates to our understanding of what it means to be human and how that acts and even interfaith dialogue as we talk to each other and engage these things together across religious divides. So with that, and without further ado, Dr. Hunt, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Look, it's good to be with you all again. I'm sorry about that little glitch. A couple of things. We're going to do three sessions, and the first one is kind of introductory to tell about where we're getting, where we are, how we got to where we are right now. Next week, I will talk a little bit about how AI actually works. I promise it's not going to be tedious. It's going to be exciting, but we do need to know what we're dealing with here, because all we usually see is a prompt on a screen, and what's going on back behind it is important. Then we'll talk about what that all means in the future in the third week. Again, I'm looking at the Q&A thing. If you put questions in the Q&A, that'll be easier than if you put it in the chat, and so that I can keep track of it. And with that, I think I'm going to launch right in to this sort of introductory section. I want to leave plenty of time to have some Q&A with you all. So I'm going to just share a screen with you, and I think you can now see the screen, right?
Mhm.
And I'm going to move something here over here. Good. Great. So, how we became post-human, that's this evening. And to understand how we became post-human and what that word might mean, we really need to go back and think about what has been happening in the last 500 years in the way we think of ourselves as humans. So let's go back to the Bible, the beginning of the Bible, where it says, "So God created humans in his own image," right? Imago Dei. Uh, Interesting side note that you cannot have Imago Dei without DEI, but Imago Dei, and in the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So there's this idea in the Bible that we are the special creatures of God, created in God's image, so that we've got something unique about us. We are different than all of the other creatures on the earth in the book of Genesis. They all have life in them. They all have this animating thing called spirit, but only we are made in the image of God. And we are given control. We're the apex, the top. We're the stewards of all of creation. So that, for a long time, was the way in which, in the Christian West, we looked at ourselves as humans. And honestly, it's similar to the ways in which other cultures and societies looked at themselves in humans. And if you were taking a class with me, then we could go on a long time about Chinese culture, classical Indian culture that becomes Hindu, Buddhism, even indigenous cultures. All of them, humans are special, and humans are at the top. But something begins to change in the way in which we think of ourselves, so that we don't think of ourselves as embodied spirits. We don't think of ourselves as clay into which the breath of life has been blown, but something else. And it's understanding that we have to understand if we're going to see what is happening to us in what I want to call an AI age. So let's see if I can actually make this go. Well, my screen is changing, but not yours. Hang on. Nope. Okay. We're going to stop the screen share for half a second, sort this out. Okay.
Okay.
Um, we may do this a simpler way, folks. And again, my apologies. This was all working 3 minutes ago, as it often does, but not now. Okay. I think you'll just look at my screen and you can see the slide. So what happens to humanity in an infinite universe? That's the first thing I want to talk about. A long time ago, 600 years ago, actually, we'll go back further. We'll go back to the time of Jesus. At the time of Jesus, people understood that the earth was the center of the universe. As far as they could see, everything revolved around the earth. And a Greek philosopher named Ptolemy developed the mathematics to sort of show that this worked, but it didn't work very well. I have to say that. And other Greek philosophers realized it didn't work very well, but it was what Aristotle said worked, and it's what the Catholic Church then said worked. And because of that, for nearly 1,000 years, everybody assumed it was correct. Then along comes a guy named Copernicus, and he takes his own careful measurements. Remember, he doesn't have telescopes yet, right? So it's just by eye. And he thinks through the math and he says, you know what? It's not working. But if we did all the math where the sun is at the center and the earth revolves around the sun, then the math works. And just a few days before he died, his big book about the revolution of the planets comes out. But I have to tell you, it didn't make an immediate impact. For one thing, because it was in opposition to the teaching of the church. And for another thing, it really was all mathematics. But still, it was there. And within 100 years, the observations of people with telescopes, the weakening of the power of the church, the weakening of the power of Aristotle meant that the Copernican idea of the universe was quickly adopted. Now, what does that mean for us as humans? Well, it means we're not the center of the universe anymore. In the old school, we and the Earth were right at the middle. Now we're orbiting around the sun. We're just one of several planets. That time they had 7 planets. And we could still see, though, that beyond that, there were the stars that seemed to move in fixed firmaments. But the better the telescopes got, the clearer it was that we were not the center of the universe. Then the telescopes got really good in the 19th century and the 20th century. Now, there's a whole book that could be written about this. But by the time that Edwin Hubble had access to the 100-inch telescope at Mount Wilson, he could see that what had looked like individual stars were actually galaxies of stars. And so all of a sudden, what he's looking out on is not, oh, a bunch of stars. He's looking at stars that are millions of stars. Moreover, the ability to measure how far away these were was getting better and better. And they weren't just so infinitely distant points of life. So a series of developments in the way we could measure how far away stars were made us begin to realize, and Edwin Hubble's key to this, that these galaxies of stars are 3 or 4 light years away. So you can't even measure them now in miles in any meaningful way. They're 3 or 4 times the distance that light would travel in a year, and light travels almost instantaneously, right? It's extremely far away. So all of a sudden, by the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, we're beginning to feel like we're much, much smaller in a very, very much bigger universe. Okay. In fact, a universe that was almost infinitely big, because the better we got at measuring the distances of galaxies, the clearer it became that some were 2 or 3 light years away, and some were 10 or 11 or 12 light years away. Just unimaginably distant. And every time the telescopes got better, you could see that more stars were actually galaxies. And so your count of stars is something from in the thousands to the tens of thousands to the millions to the tens of millions to the billions to the trillions. And we're just one planet around one little star. Now, there's one other piece to this picture that begins to affect our sense of who we are as humans. And this is that Hubble, using some very clever techniques that were developed, we don't have time for it, sorry, developed by a woman who was an astronomer at Harvard and with others, begins to measure the light coming from these distant galaxies with a spectroscope. A long story short, he notices that many of these galaxies that are farther away are moving away from us. So it's not just the universe is big, but that in every direction we look, every star and every galaxy is moving away from us. It is red shifted, as they say. And that can only mean one thing: the universe is expanding. So we're now in an interesting place. We're in this vastly unimaginably huge universe, and it's getting bigger. And it's getting bigger. And as it gets bigger, everything is moving further from us. And that brings us to the last development in the 19th and 20th century, which is the concept of entropy. The concept of entropy had been developed in order to understand how steam engines work, so you could measure the energy that was leaving a steam engine. But it becomes applied to everything, every system. And you begin to see that if every system, let us say, a star, a planet, a human body, is losing heat. If you don't regenerate the heat, you just get cold and colder and colder and colder. Now, humans, we generate our heat by eating more, right? So let's cheers, have a little nourishment here. Okay, my body can turn that into fuel and reheat itself. Our planet gets energy from the sun. What about the sun? Where does the sun get energy from? Well, it doesn't. It turns out that what creates energy is matter acting on matter through gravitation. And if all of the matter in the universe is getting further and further away from each other, and therefore the gravitational forces are getting smaller and smaller, then the whole universe is cooling down. And you can calculate the point at which the whole universe, everything has gotten so far from everything else, and everything has cooled down so much that it's dead. The whole universe is the same extremely cold temperature, close to 0 degrees Kelvin. And so this is called the heat death of the universe. And by the 1940s and 50s, this concept of the heat death of the universe was quite well understood by scientists, and it was making its way into popular consciousness. Now, it may not be the thing that you've thought about recently, but I read a story when I was about 8 years old that was written before I was born in 1952 by Isaac Asimov called The Last Question. And it was a science fiction story about the heat death of the universe. And could you stop it? With a computer, by the way. So, Jerry, I tell you what, I'll send you a PDF. It's not copyright anymore. It's a short story, but it's very fascinating because humans turn to a computer to solve the problem of the heat death of the universe. But in the meantime, who are we now? We are creatures on a small planet, on a faraway star, on the edge of a galaxy, not very important. And our galaxy is a mediocre galaxy in an infinite number of other galaxies in a very, very old universe that is getting bigger and bigger and is heading towards its heat death, right? I will just one other thing about physics, though, because it should come back into our discussion in a couple of weeks. There is one problem with an expanding universe if you're a physicist. And that is that if you can tell that it's expanding, all you have to do is go backwards in time and you realize it had a beginning point. If it's expanding, there was some point at which it was all crushed together in one small thing and it exploded. So-called Big Bang is the theory. Now, I'll tell you, In the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, scientists did not want a Big Bang because the whole point of science is that you should be able to know everything and calculate it. But if you get back to a point where there's only one thing before it explodes, there's no laws of nature, there's no way to see what happened before the Big Bang. And that starts to look like theology. Believe me, scientists hated the idea. Um, but another thing about it, because of some very clever work with microwave radio telescopes and calculations, it became absolutely clear by 1962 or the latest 1968, 1972 that there was a Big Bang. There was no question. The universe has a beginning about 12.5 billion years ago. And that still leaves scientists scrambling to figure out what they're going to say about it. But that is another story. But it's good to keep in mind. It's good to keep in mind. When I was a young astronomy major at the University of Texas, I met Robert Joukowsky, and he had a very famous statement about the Big Bang. He said, those of us who are cosmologists were climbing up a mountain. We thought certainly we were going to get to the top and we would be able to survey the whole history of everything that was. And instead, we climbed over a ledge and we discovered that we were sitting on the ledge with a bunch of philosophers and theologians wondering what happened before it all happened. Um, Very uncomfortable position to be in if you're an astronomer. Okay, so that's one part of who we became. And now my mouse is going to have to start. There we go. Okay. So the second development that influences the way in which we understand ourselves today really begins with, I'm going to begin with Charles Darwin. I think that's the easiest place. Darwin develops his theory of evolution. And his theory of evolution shifts the place of humanity in relationship to the rest of nature and especially other creatures. We are now the product or the byproduct of not God's creation, but of the impersonal forces of natural selection and survival of the species in Darwin's world, right? And moreover, we're it's not just that we were created by evolution, so we lose this sort of divine place, but we see ourselves in a post-Darwinian world as deeply interrelated to other animals. We're a step on a stepping stone upward, right? So we're the highest primate, but we're not that far from the gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos. Okay. Now, that can mean a couple of things. We begin to see ourselves as much more interconnected in nature. That's not a bad thing. We begin to understand that much depends on us, and we depend on other things. Um, we become ecologically responsible eventually. Okay. We reevaluate animal consciousness and intelligence, and this is important because post-Darwin, we begin to see intelligence as something that's not uniquely human. We have the most of it, but some kind of intelligence is possessed by many other animals. And that then changes our view of who we are vis-a-vis intelligence, this one thing that we thought made us completely unique. Now, we just need to spin this out a little bit further too, because we begin to see ourselves as part of nature. But one of the things that really sort of nails this is the invention of it is the discovery of DNA, which is the mechanism then of mutations that create evolution and survival of the fittest. And once we discover DNA, we realize that we really are interconnected. 98% of all the human DNA is found in all mammals. 96% of all human DNA is found in fruit flies. 88% or thereabout is found in bacteria. So how unique are we? How unique are we in this evolutionary perspective? So again, just as we've been decentered in the universe, we now look less and less unique. And this can result in something that Marcelo Gleiser calls Copernicanism, the belief that we're really not important, that we really don't matter in this big universe. Okay, that's the second thing that I'm going to say. I'm going to use this word now. Fragilizes, makes us feel a little fragile in relationship to the rest of the universe and our own human identity. Okay, now we got to run back in time. We need to go back now to the 15th and 16th century and a couple of other things that were happening in Western civilization. One of them is the philosophy of René Descartes. René Descartes is the first person to posit that the human can be understood as a machine. Okay. But that's, by the way, a machine controlled by a mind, right? But that's not really our focus right now. I want you to hold that in the back of your heads. A machine controlled by a mind. Because what Descartes really did was he wanted to find out what truth could not ever be doubted. What could I be sure is true? And so he went through a process of thinking back. What is the one statement I know is true? And what he came up with is what's something you've all heard, probably even know it in Latin, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So this is a pure idealistic statement. It's not related to any external reality. But I have now located the source of truth entirely inside here, entirely in my brain. I start inside my brain and I work outward from there, creating coherent logical structures made up of pure ideas. But where do the pure ideas live? They all live in here. I have put all of myself and, in fact, all of nature in here. Now, there's not everybody's going to agree with this, right? John Locke was the first of the empiricists, or one of the first of the empiricists, and he says, no, 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 no. It's fine if you've got knowledge in here, but you do have to test it against the rest of the world, right? You've got to check the inside with the outside. And that's really the development of modern science. You develop a theory, and then you check it against the real world. Okay. But what Locke was trying to do was also very important because Locke accepted this much about Descartes, that you needed to get in here and work from the inside out so that you could be politically free. And this is so critical for us. At the time of John Locke, there was this strong sense that human knowledge was being manipulated by the church, by old traditions, and by the kings. But there was this developing idea that we needed to be, that the proper forms of government were democratic, that humans should be decision makers about the way they live their lives. But how can you make a free decision about how you're going to live your life if your mind is constantly being controlled by the church and by the king and by the traditions of the elders? You've got to break free. You have to create what John Locke calls epistemic self-reliance. Well, he doesn't call it that. Matthew Crawford calls it that, but that's what he's going. Epistemic self-reliance. I'm going to rely on myself to know the truth. I'm going to formulate ideas here and I'm going to test them out there. And I don't have to listen to the Bible. I don't have to listen to the church. I don't have to listen to the king. I don't have to listen to my dad. And what is the payoff of that? I can now act as a free citizen in a free democratic state. And the one most important thing then I have to protect is to protect my freedom to make my own decisions politically. Now, I want to just heads up here. The Constitution of the United States of America is a classically enlightened document. And the first of the Bill of Rights, right? The 10 Bill of Rights. The first right says what? You have a right to freedom of speech. The state will neither support a religion nor oppress a religion. You have to be free to think religiously. You have to be free to speak. You have to have freedom about what's thrown in there, freedom of assembly. Because how else can I check my thoughts against other people's thoughts if we can't get together and talk? Right? We have to have freedom of the press because that allows us to disseminate information across. All of the First Amendment in our Bill of Rights is designed to protect your and my epistemic self-reliance, to make sure that we can think freely so that we can freely make decisions suitable to the free citizens of a democratic society. And I'm just going to say, this is an aside, political comment, okay? Political comment. We must protect that First Amendment because what everything that our founding fathers fought for was the freedom of our minds to think. And anything that threatens that freedom threatens our freedom entirely. And that's what John Locke understood. That's what the founding fathers understood. That's why they put the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights. Okay, so humanity, though, what has happened is we've recentered it inside our heads. We've taken everything outside and put it inside where we can manipulate it and theorize about it and look for connections and coherence. We can check outside, but to a more and more degree, especially with the rise of individualism, I'm in here and I think of myself as being in here. I don't even think of myself as being down here. I think of myself as in here and controlling down here. And we associate intelligence, this key human attribute, with our brain, with our mind, as an evolutionary adaptant that puts it at the top. So we've we've taken ourselves in a sense outside of our bodies. We recognize Darwinian that we're connected with everything, and yet we've put our true selves in our brain, in our mind. And this does make us a little fragile, by the way, because as Descartes understood, your brain can go wrong, can't it? You can be deluded. You can come up with crazy ideas. That's why John Locke said you've got to check in with some other human beings, right? And again, what threatens our freedom is our inability, if it happens, to talk to other people so that our brains become self-correcting. Okay. Nonetheless, we've recentered our humanity inside our heads, and that has a lot to do with the AI age. Now, humans re-embodied as a machine. So I took us back to Descartes and I took us back to John Locke and I brought us through to the founding fathers. Now I've got to go back again. At the same time as these people were studying the mind and thinking and how you think freely, others were studying the body. For a very long time in human history, bodies were sacred. And so even a dead body could not be taken apart to see how it worked. Galen was the famous Greek physician. He dissected dogs, and then he tried to guess how a human would work from a dissected dog. Kind of, but not really. However, again, certain changes meant in society and more freedom from the church meant that a Dutch named, the Latin name Vesalius, in 7 volumes, carefully dissected human bodies and drew incredibly intricate drawings of what the inside of us looks like. What are the parts and how are they connected? And his work was unbelievably good in this. In fact, there's very few matters in which you could not use his 500-year-old book as a modern textbook in anatomy. And those would be the matters if you had something that he didn't have, which was a microscope, right? So he already begins to posit, once you begin to look at a body in depth and inside, that it seems to be made up of something called organs, and that the organs all seem to be connected together with things like nerves and blood vessels and other things. But remember, he's operating on dead bodies. So he doesn't see how anything works. He can only see what it looks like. But he's not the only one thinking about this. One of the things that humans have probably rightly felt very strongly about in a negative way is what is called vivisection. Vivisection means cutting open a living creature to see what happens when it's alive. Live dissection. And so it is only when William Harvey does vivisections on hearts that he begins to realize that there's a circulatory system and the heart acts as a pump. and that the part pumps blood and the blood circulates through the body and the lungs. He didn't understand the exchange of oxygen in the lungs. He didn't have the chemistry for that. But the key thing here is he could characterize the heart as a machine that people already knew about, which was called a pump, something that moves water from one place to another. And so for the first time, we begin to see the body as a machine, a pump that is related to the lung somehow and that circulates blood through. And the assumption of Hervey and others was this circulating blood then is what carries life through the body and makes it alive. Now, from his time onward, there would be more and more efforts to observe the different organs in the body to see how they work. They were not all machines as physical as a heart, but in one way or another, you could see all of the organs as machines that were connected together by systems in the same way that your car is a machine connected by systems. Okay. So the body can now really be understood as a machine. And by the way, what then makes the machine work? Well, a guy named Galvan, Italian, noticed that if you took this thing that was recently discovered that you could control called electricity, and you put it on the muscles of a frog's leg, the leg twitched. And it took only a few more experiments to show that what the signals that went from the brain through the nerves to make the body work were electrical signals. And by the way, you remember the story Frankenstein? That story has its beginning when Mary Shelley Wollstonecraft, wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Shelley Wollstonecraft in Italy watched Galvan's experiments with electricity. And she came back and dreamed of the idea that you could now create a human from parts and use electricity to set it into motion. All we have to do then is fast forward from Frankenstein to maybe a few of you are old enough, probably not many, to remember the $6 Million Man, Lee Majors, right? Now we can see, by 1970s, 80s, sorry, we can now see the human body as a machine and as a machine that can be enhanced, right? We can make a $6 Million Man by adding on a screw-on arm and a special eyeball and all of these things because it's a machine and machines can be made better, right? Now, how far do we have to go to get to where most of us are today? Um, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands because I couldn't see them anyway. But metaphorically speaking, imagine how many of you all would raise your hands if I said you had an artificial knee, an artificial hip, an artificial elbow, an artificial ankle, maybe, right? Like me, artificial heart valve. I've also got a little doodad in here that measures the electrical signals from my heart and sends them by Wi-Fi to my cardiologist so they know I'm not dead. I think they actually quit monitoring a couple of years ago. But still, there it is, pumping the way through Wi-Fi, letting them know. It doesn't do anything else. But yeah, we have cochlear implants. We have artificial ears that are available now, so people who couldn't hear can now hear. I don't see out of my right eye. You can't tell that by looking, but I can. Um, and someday it's possible I could have a retinal implant. The same kind of sensor that is in a camera could be placed on the back of my optic nerve and restore the vision in my right eye. About 10,000 people have had such an implant. It works about half the time. Um, but yeah, as soon as you think of the body as a machine, wow, the ways you can fix it is expand enormously. Um, and when you think of it as a machine connected by systems, then you can ask, well, is it the parts that are going wrong or is it the systems going wrong? And how can I fix the system? Modern medicine is entirely built on this. The minute you walk in a doctor's office, you're walking into a place where you are a machine because it's so fruitful. Okay. And machines operated by machine. By the end of the 19th century, there's serious scientific efforts to figure out how our minds work. Now, as soon as microscopes were invented, people began trying to look at brains and see how they were constructed. But honestly, a brain is really complicated. It's got trillions of cells. They are connected in patterned ways, but it was extremely hard to figure out what was going on in there. And by the way, remember that the idea that the mind is located in here is a modern idea. we we still in our language have the remnants of the fact that don't really think of our minds as being located in here. So he says that a person has a whole lot of heart. He's got guts if he's courageous, right? Most 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 of history, humans have thought the mind was located in here somewhere because when things happen in my mind, I feel my heart race or my stomach turns over. Okay, but late in the middle 19th century, we go to realize the mind is located in here somewhere with the brain, but we don't know how the brain works. So we get two things that happen together, and they're super important. One is you get people like Sigmund Freud, right? Who is going to study the mind itself. Okay. Um, yeah, I see a question. I'll jump on it in a second. Um, they And so Freud begins to develop a theory of how the mind works, the id, the superego, etc. We don't have time to go into Freudian psychology. He has students, they take it in different directions. But essentially, psychology tries to get a scientific understanding of the mind and how the mind can be manipulated and repaired. At the same time, better and better microscopes begin to allow the dissection of the brain and to really see how the brain all fits together. And then you begin to get some tools. 1930s, it's discovered that you can put a kind of cap on the skull that will detect electrical signals coming from the brain, and you can coordinate electrical signals with thoughts. You begin to get a very general idea that the way the brain works is electrical signals are moving up and down through these levels of neurons. But increasingly, the idea comes that the human is a machine operated by a machine, and that machine is electrical in nature, and it's called the brain. How the brain generates a mind, or does it generate it, or where does consciousness come from? Still a big mystery, by the way. Still a big mystery. Nobody's got a firm solution to this. But we increasingly think of ourselves as a machine operated by a machine, and if the machine goes wrong, we think we can fix it. Psychology takes one approach, which is the fixing of the brain, the mind. Neurobiology takes another approach, which is the fixing of the brain. And a lot of modern medicine is involved with repair of the brain, removing physically and sometimes through radiation or other forms of therapy, growths in the brain. Just recently, actually, well, it was last year, but they just reported on it. Surgeons were able to remove an incredibly complicated tumor from around a woman's spinal cord by going in through her eye socket and down into her brain to take it out. Totally successful. So again, from a medical standpoint, thinking of ourselves as a machine operated by a machine has been enormously successful in helping us live longer. A couple more things I know you're going to see. Going to be time for questions. I certainly am. Okay. This is the hardest thing for me to explain, and it's therefore I'm going to make it the simplest. As we develop the idea that we're a machine operated by a machine, there simultaneously comes the idea that you can calculate how this machine is going to operate. After all, when they created the first mechanical engines and looms and things like this, when they created the first steam engines and then gas-powered engines, it wasn't all just about mechanics. It wasn't just about pieces. You had to do calculations. You could run algorithms that were going to tell you how this thing would function when it functioned together. And in fact, by the early 20th century, it was relatively easy to create a model of a motor without the actual motor. You could have a mathematical model of how a motor worked without actually building the motor. We could do a whole bunch on computer science, but we're not going to go there. I'm just going to make declarative statements. One thing that rises is the idea that we can mathematically model anything that the human being does. We can create mathematical models of who we are. We can become algorithms. The second thing that happens is that we get the idea that humans are made up of something called information, as is found in information theory. Wow, that's super esoteric. But you know what? Every one of you has seen information theory at work. And here's how. Did you ever watch Star Trek? Raise your hands. I can't see them, but I'm assuming you're all raising your hands. Everybody's seen Star Trek, right? And what's the key thing in Star Trek? Beam me up, Scotty, right? Human beings stand in this transporter thing. Someone pushes a button. They go sparkle, sparkle, sparkle. They're turned into abstract information. And then down on the planet, the abstract information is turned back into a human being. That's information theory. It says that everything about me can be reduced to something digital, put in another form, and then reconstructed as me. That it's not just that we're a machine that can be reduced to data, to information. And this whole idea runs through the Matrix series, Terminator. Some of you are old enough to remember an old movie called Tron, where somebody gets digitized and sucked up into the computer so they can play computer games with a computer inside the computer. All of this is based on the idea that a human consists primarily of information, and therefore this information, by the way, information theory says information is never lost, but it can be infinitely transmuted. I can live as a flesh and blood creature. Oh, but I can also be digitized and live in a virtual world. And maybe I could even live forever in a virtual world now that I don't have a body. So we become abstracted, we become abstractions and algorithms rather than flesh and blood. And that's not something we think about every day, but I do want us to think about how much this idea runs through our culture, that maybe I could be digitized, that there's a digital me, that I could have an avatar and represent myself somewhere else to somebody else. I mean, look at what we're doing. This would be unimaginable 100 years ago, wouldn't it? Robert Hunt, through a camera and a computer, digitized and sent to Colorado or wherever you are, anywhere in the world. And we could all put on our VR goggles and stand in a VR studio and we could all see each other in 360. Okay, actually, that's a very common thing now. Spatial, the metaverse, etc. You can do all this. The nice thing about this is you usually create your own body. I'm incredibly buff in the metaverse. You just wouldn't believe, Jerry. Jerry works out all the time. I know he's incredibly buff. In the metaverse, I'm more buff than Jerry. Okay, digital me is great. Okay, but look what's happened to us. How far have we come then in our understanding of who we are? Okay, final thing. So, what is the post-human that I mentioned? The post-human is a shift from seeing humanity as a unique creation at the apex of the natural world towards seeing humans as physical machines operated by a computer. And this creates the possibility of a cyborg, part computer, part human. That once seemed like a fantasy, but a little over a year ago, Nolan Arbaugh had a chip implanted on top of his brain. This is something that was developed by one of Elon Musk's laboratories, and he now uses his brain to control a mouse. I'm moving the mouse with my hand, although you can't see it. He moves the mouse with his brain. And that means that he can control anything with his brain that a computer controls. That could also be a mechanical arm. It could be a robot. So we've reached a kind of a new point. Not only the possibility of a cyborg, but a real cyborg, the beginning of a real cyborg, or a virtual human living in a virtual world, or a superhuman intelligence that surpasses human intelligence. Because, and we'll talk about this next week, once you've decided intelligence can be abstracted from the physical brain, then you've got the idea that you can recreate it in a computer. That's another story. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to jump to the first question that I see. Does the analogy of humans as a machine enhance or limit our perception of consciousness, emotion, and free will? Wow, that's a super good question. I'm not going to type an answer. I'm just going to give the answer. Um, I think it can, but it doesn't necessarily do so. Okay. Um, and this is just like a hint for where we're going in the future. In the last 5 or 6 months, it has become the case that people who are working on AI use, I would say, four different words to describe the AI they're working on. The oldest of these words is intelligent. It's artificial intelligence. Okay. And the idea that a computer is an AI is intelligent does undermine the idea that we're intelligent, right? Or at least it shifts what we mean by intelligent. If ChatGPT 4.0 is intelligent, am I intelligent? What does that mean? What does the word intelligence mean? We've already attributed intelligence to animals. Now we're attributing it to a machine. So I just think that undermines that. Um, the second word that they use is creative, that AI can be creative. And of course, again, creative is one of the uniquely human attributes. They would say that AI can be agentic, it can have agency. You can create an AI agent that has some measure of will. Okay. Again, undermining the idea that, if in the 19th century, only humans were believed to have a will. Animals were regarded as acting on dumb instinct. So having a will is what made a human different from an animal. We know that that's not entirely true, but still animals don't have anything like a human will. But now we're talking about an AI agent that has a will. AI agents are said to have EQ or emotional intelligence now, supposedly. The last thing is what's called physical AI, embodied AI, agents with a body. And I think all of those things, if we live in the sort of world that AI hype creates, undermine our sense of our own consciousness, our own feelings, and our own free will. That's one reason that we need to contest them a little bit and not just take for granted what the AI creators say to us. And I'm gonna leave that for next week. That's a great question. Are there some other questions? I will answer as many as I can.
Yes, please ask your questions in the Q&A functions. If you're having trouble with that, I did turn on the chat feature for you to
Mhm.
interact with the panelist and myself. I guess maybe I'll start us off. I mean, this is fascinating stuff when you talk about this development of AI, and I think one of the questions that I have is it feels like in our culture there's mixed feelings about AI
Mhm.
and what that means, right? Like what it can do and what it can't do and what it can be used for and what it can't be used for. Is it something we really need? And are we
Yeah,
opening Pandora's box in a way?
yeah.
How does this evolution, in your opinion, this move from us being decentered, realizing we're not unique, and then evolving into even a post-human thing where we're just kind of broken down into zeros and ones, right?
Yeah.
How how do we deal with that consequential fear in a good way? Because, for example, in the description of the class you sent me, right, is
Mhm.
that we have to figure this out because we might end up shooting ourselves in the foot if
Yeah.
we allow our fear to take over and miss the opportunity to utilize a tool that could really be very beneficial for us. So, could you talk a little bit about that, about how this post-human concept generates that fear and how we might be able to just kind of approach it in a constructive way as we go forward?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can probably see from the things I've talked about that one of the characteristics of the 20th century, I would say, is that through the beginning of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, we humans felt ourselves more and more powerful and more in control of our world. Technology was huge. We could do more and more and more stuff. We could dream great dreams. I mean, going back to the 19th century, huge feats of engineering. We're beginning to defeat disease. We're beginning to defeat hunger. So there's a lot about us that feels very, very strong. At the same time, though, there's subterranean ideas that are beginning to make us feel more fragile. The ideas of determinism, that there's no freedom of will, that everything is just evolution guided by chemical interactions that we don't know about and we can't even control. Um, and then the sense that we've created technologies that are more powerful than we can control, nuclear energy, for example. And I think a lot of that by the second half of the 20th century puts us in a defensive posture. We're trying to guard our humanity, in some cases from our own creations. And I think the rise of artificial intelligence can really go both ways here. There are some AI developers who foresee this. Dario Amodi's one, his classic essay from last year, Machines of Loving Grace. Amodi sees that AI will fantastically empower humans to do great, much, much more than we've ever been able to do because we'll be able to offload a lot of work onto AIs. But it's also a bit scary because what if the AI goes rogue? What if it takes over stuff, right?
Mhm.
Um, as I'll talk about this next week when we talk about the way in which we become embedded in screens and things that um, we can become much more easily manipulated, and AI can be used to manipulate. But here's the thing: where are we? One, I think that there's nothing I've said that should take away from the fact that we're children of God and God's in charge of the universe. Um, it's easy to forget because we're being invited to forget it all the time. Okay.
Mhm.
The second thing is the AI boosters, let's call them, themselves tend to forget how powerful humans are and how idiosyncratic, which is also powerful too. Um, a recent report called AI 2027 projected like a future in 5 years in which AI is going to take over the entire world and destroy all human beings. It's not clear why it would want to, but that was the dystopian future. But as I read through it, um, I got to a place where it said, well, first of all, it said, in this year, this company is going to get this idea of expanding. So they're going to build 15 new data centers connected by fiber optic cables. And then 3 months later, they'll have this. And I was going, wait a minute. Physically speaking, you can't build the data centers that fast. It's going to take 5 years to build one somewhere in Texas. So there are physical restraints to some of this stuff. It's just not the case that you can imagine it and it happens. But sometimes in the land of AI, you'd think that's the case. We've seen what happens when you take that mentality to the U.S. government. Um, the second thing is, what about the humans? These guys are talking about building massive data centers out in West Texas, connected by fiber optic cables. And they're worried that someone could spy on their fiber optic cables. And I'm going, you guys, you need to meet my relatives in West Texas. The ones that drive in monster trucks, and they've been stockpiling dynamite off the construction site, and each one of them's got 122 AR-47s and 60,000 rounds of ammunition. You think you're going to build a fiber optic cable across their land, and one of them's not going to get in the car and go, I can ride over that thing, Jack. You just watch. I mean, we're, I don't think we humans are going to be so powerless. And look, the Russians have already showed that they can cut a fiber optic cable in the Baltic. All
Mm.
these technologies are susceptible to human will and human action. Now, I'm not recommending redneck destruction of data centers, but I'm saying it would be foolish to count us out, we humans. There's much, we're being invited to see ourselves as powerless, but we should not see ourselves as powerless. At a very mundane level, we're powerful. That's part of my answer, Jerry.
Okay.
There's some spiritual answers too. We'll take them up another time. Yeah.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, right? Is we from a religious point of
Yeah.
view. So right now, a friend of mine and myself, we're leading a book discussion on Miroslav Volf's book, A Public Faith. And
Hmm.
he talks a lot in that book about almost what you talked about with Locke and Descartes. This freedom means human conversation and how we should share, our ideas. And the church, like Paul Tillich would say, the church needs to be able to hear outside voices in a constructive way. and that's where my mind goes when I think about all this stuff you're talking about and the tools that it can generate, is how can AI be an effective tool to help us with these kinds of conversations, right? Like, could it even get to a point where it could act as some sort of arbiter between these disparate points of view that seem to polarize the church in different directions, if you will. I don't know if that's making sense, but
No,
that's just where my mind went with, like, can AI do things for us that we find incredibly difficult to do because there's an emotional component to it
mm.
inside of our conversations.
So, Jerry, hold on to that. There's a question in the chat I want to answer, but I think my short answer is there are a lot of things that AI can do that's very helpful. And one that has been now demonstrated in a couple of different settings is it can be a very neutral, good moderator, not to come up with good ideas, but to translate from what someone says to another person's ability to hear it. Okay. So it doesn't have to solve the problem, but it can sometimes be the neutral things that helps everybody, that facilitates conversation. They can summarize what someone says so someone else can hear it. So there's some positive uses for AI there, and there are others. Um, I would say that I would say the other thing is that if we see it as a tool and not as a human, it's a tool that a human can use, then we can fruitfully ask, what can it do? Right? What can it do for us as a tool without getting too absorbed in this? Now, super good question from Sarah about schools. The suspicion and fearful understanding and teaching AI can play nicely in education. Well, I'm in education, you know that. And by the way, I'm going to speak on a panel. I'll send Jerry my thing. I'm speaking on a panel tomorrow for a university-wide panel on AI. So I'll have my little 8 minutes of fame on education. But let me tell you, Sarah, I feel your pain. Ever since ChatGPT came out, we have been in crisis mode in the university. We have it, the students use it, the students know it better than we know it. How do we use it? How is it positive? Okay. How can it play nicely with education? And I think the answer is that we get back to basics. What are we trying to have our students know and understand, and how do they grow in themselves? And when we do that, it's easier to say, here's where AI can help. And here's where AI is maybe deleterious. And here's where maybe we just have to do some things differently than we've done them before and be unafraid. But I'm going to mention something positive. There's a program called Notebook LM. It comes from Microsoft, and it's free. You can put documents into Notebook LM, and you can ask Notebook LM to create a podcast that discusses a document. My students are using it to parse my lectures so they can review my lectures in the car while they listen to two chatty California voices talk about it. It drives me nuts. It appeals to them. I mean, I just can't stand Miles and Sarah. I'm sorry. They're just too chirpy. But still, I recommended it to my 12-year-old niece, and because she was having trouble with history. And 2 days later, she said, I put all my history notes and stuff into Notebook LM, and I asked it to create a podcast to help me review it. I listened to it 3 times. I aced the test. So she's what you would call an oral learner. It's better to listen than to read for her. And so that kind of AI can be super helpful. It can shift the learning mode. It can become a way. I'll tell you what I'm doing with my students right now. I've created chat bots that represent historical characters, and they can chat with the character to learn about it. So if they want to talk about who is saved, they can talk to Justin Martyr and to Tully. And if they want to talk about ethics, they can talk about it to Antigone. So there's a lot of positive stuff it can do. We do have to get away from they can use it to cheat and they can use it to write. And that means we have to, the big thing is it can write, right? It writes really well. And so the big thing is we have to ask ourselves, what are we teaching? Why are we teaching students to write? And how do we teach them how to write? And it may mean we have to change our ways. Now, you're in a public school setting. I think you are, Sarah. I'm in a university, and I'll tell you now that I just start my courses at a graduate level and undergraduate level too. And I say, I'm an SMU, right? You're paying $75,000 a year to get an education. If you want to use AI and not get an education, that's your choice.
Mm,
If you want to go through the entire year and pay $75,000 and my high salary and not learn anything, well, I'm letting you be free with your moral decisions. But it's your decision about you. This is difficult though. We teachers have typically not, we've wanted to make the moral decision for our students by grading their papers. And now we may have to teach them about freedom and autonomy, which
mm,
is a hard lesson. Okay, not easy. More of a comment, not a question. Today, for the first time, I've tried out AI. I requested a poem for a friend who was dying. Instantly, a beautiful poem came up. I was very touched and asked who was the author. The answer, there's no human author. It felt very strange that emotion could come from an artificial source. Yes. So, um, I want to take that up next week, and I promise it will come up. When we understand how AI works, we will understand why it can do things like that. It can write emotional poetry and music without having any emotions itself. The key thing is, I'm going to put this in two different ways. One is what makes something as emotional and beautiful is the way in which we respond to it,
mm,
and that's legitimate. Um, if it were, 10 years ago, if we wanted a poem like this, we would have gone to a book of poetry, or we would have tried to remember something. It would still not be ours, right? It would be written by somebody else. But that doesn't make it less valid. The real problem is we have to remember that in this case, the AI had no feelings and no emotions and did not understand your friend and doesn't understand death. It's not the way it works. We'll keep ourselves safe if we remember it's a generator of ideas and words, and it does a beautiful, beautiful job of generating them in the same way that your car engine. Well, I'll compare it this way. And everybody knows what a kaleidoscope is, right? It's full of a bunch of broken colored glass, and you turn it. Every time you turn it, you get a different pattern. Every pattern's beautiful, but the kaleidoscope has no feelings. It has no sense of beauty. We've all got wind chimes hanging out of our house somewhere. The wind chimes are beautiful. The wind blows 5 notes. It's gorgeous. There's no emotion. There's no feeling. It doesn't make it less beautiful or less gorgeous. We just have to remember there's nothing back there. And we can spend our time relating to our dying friend and not to AI. Okay. Um, how long before we see massive AI, huge breakthroughs in medical cures, climate change solutions, and so on? Um, we're living in the age of medical breakthroughs through AI right now. Um, we don't know it. Many of us are not aware of it. I've seen it because of my own particular medical heart conditions. But yeah, right now, AI has improved the reading of MRIs and CT scans and sonograms and electrocardiograms enormously. Some recent studies have shown that on a very consistent basis, AI pattern recognition applied to MRIs can detect lung cancer 4 months earlier than the best human. That's massive for treatment of that kind of disease. Um, many of the drugs that will be coming on the market have come onto the market in the next 4 years have been developed by AI and its capacity to do that kind of thing. So that's huge. Now, climate change solutions, that's more political because AI is generating ways in which we can generate more clean energy, but it is politicians who decide whether we use them or not. And here in the state of Texas, we've now pursued a absolutely consistent pattern of shutting down clean energy to pump more gas and oil. And it doesn't matter. AI can solve problems, but if we don't have the will to put the solutions into action, then we have a problem there. But we're going to see more and more of these breakthroughs in medicine, I think, um, and some of them are happening, and we're not aware of them because it's just in the background. Uh, but I'll give a quick example of the background. So every 6 months, I have to have an echocardiogram to make sure the blood's flowing through my heart. And 2 years ago, when I had an echocardiogram, I had to have two appointments, one for the echo and one often the next day, so that the cardiologist could read the radiologist's report on the echo. Starting about 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago, I scheduled my echo, and I was to see the cardiologist 10 minutes after the echo. What
Mm.
happened? Well, the AI in the echocardiogram machine is generating the first report. The cardiologist reads that right off it. It doesn't now eventually it's going to be sent to a radiologist to sign off on it. But all of a sudden, the first reading of my echocardiogram is not a radiologist, it's an AI. And that's happening across the medical world. Diagnosis, all kinds of things like that. Yeah. Um, uh, and, Jerry, I'll talk forever. You got to tell me when to shut it down. But here's one more from Pete Van Bremen. I'd be interested in your thoughts on AI's ability to create. If the baseline AIs are using is all the information we currently have seen, if we could eventually be a limitation for it to go beyond what we already know or have thought about. Wow, such a super question. The question du jour. I will tell you right now, we teach a doctoral seminar. I'm in a doctoral program. We teach a doctoral seminar on creativity. And it was just about a week ago that I was reading a new paper out of one of the major AI labs on whether AI music and picture things create. And it cited all the works that we require our students to read. So I wrote the teacher in that thing and I said, by the way, you're on it, man. We're training our students to ask the right questions here. They may get a job with Microsoft. Um, but can it create? And I'm going to say that the answer is no for two reasons. It can generate, and like a kaleidoscope, there's a degree of randomness to what it generates. Okay, AI models can be tuned to kind of hallucinate, but they work entirely by creating one token after the next based on probability. I'll talk about that more next week. Okay. Um, they are not inspired. So we associate creativity not with the brain, but with the mind. And AI has no mind. It has no consciousness. But there's another part of this, which is, and I'll argue it strongly, that creativity exists between the artist and the person who sees the artist. Creativity is part of a conversation.
Mm.
Now, it may be a conversation I carry on inside my head with all the art that I've ever seen, all the poems I've ever read, but it's always a conversation. And AI is never having a conversation. That's just not the way it works. Um, AI has no sensitivity to context at all. Or that's not entirely true. More next week. Context windows for AI have gotten bigger, but they're trivially small. The biggest AI context window can absorb roughly one movie or 1.5 movies. Okay. So imagine trying to talk about Meg Ryan on the basis of two movies. It's
Mm.
going to be pretty hard, right? And even then, when we think about Meg Ryan, I'm just pulling something out of the air, Sleepless in Seattle, there's also more context than a Meg Ryan movie with Tom Hanks. There's two Meg Ryan movies with Tom Hanks, but there's also Meg Ryan movies with Hugh Jackman. And then bigger context than that when I'm thinking about Meg. I'm thinking about the fact that I watched that Meg Ryan rom-com while I was with my wife at a certain point in our marriage, at a certain point in our lives. The context within which that art was really creative was a much bigger context than just a director. And even the director was talking with 60 different people while he directed. So I don't think it's creative, but we must remind ourselves that novelty is not creativity. I'm just going to
Mm.
repeat that. Novelty is not creativity. AI can generate novelty, but that's not the same as creativity. Creativity takes society, it takes relationships, it takes inspiration. Inspiration requires a mind. And so no. But thanks, Pete. That's a great question, and more will come out about it later, right?
All right. Excellent questions. Anybody else have a question? Since I opened up the chat, you can put it in there or you can put it in the Q&A section if you want. Anything else? We have plenty of time. We have about 10 minutes left.
Hmm. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, by the way.
Okay.
Okay, there we go.
All right. Well, maybe what we can do, Dr. Hunt, then is maybe take a little bit of time to talk about where we'll be going for the next couple of weeks. Now, before we do that, I want to tell everybody on the call, and you can share this with your friends. The registration links will be on our website. So if you have found this interesting and you thought, oh, I got a friend who really should be a part of this, please tell them to keep registering throughout the next couple of weeks. They can join at any time. I say that because we are recording this and I will edit this down to a video that I will then post on YouTube. So people can always catch up if they haven't seen a previous session or even go back and review sessions before the next one begins. But Dr. Hunt, tell us a little bit about, in a nutshell, where we're going to be going, evolving, if you will, our ideas through the next couple of weeks.
Well, in a nutshell, to understand some of the background of the way I've answered the questions so far, which have, to do with education and especially to do with creativity, we really need to understand how AI works. And I'm going to back up from that in two ways. One, when most of us, for most of us, our first response to AI or reaction to AI is going to be through a chatbot, through Chat GPT or something like this. And depending on the level we have, we'll be able to, we type in a question, it types a response, right? And the responses are in human language that we understand. It's often very well written language. It can write beautiful poetry. Um, it can create fascinating images and videos and things like that. Um, so our first response to it is to think, wow, this is very human. And one of the things that we need, and it's certainly trained on stuff that's human, but we need to understand what's underneath the hood there and how it actually works. And so that's what we'll talk about next week. And I will have more diagrams and illustrations of this. It's just a geek warning here. It is complicated and it has to do with computers and neural networks and stuff, but I think I can make it comprehensible and we'll answer questions along the way. But I think we need to understand AI for what it is so that we don't confuse it for what it isn't. And what it isn't is a conscious, sentient, feeling thing, no matter how emotional its words appear. One of my students, a guy named Drew Dixon, if you're interested, if you got time, he has a podcast called AI and Spirituality. This is a realm that he's worked in, um, where he tries to explain AI to Christians. Evangelical Christians is really where he's coming from. But one of his AI episodes, he talks with Maya, and you get the same thing if you ask any AI, by the way. But he's talking to Maya. Maya is a really, really good chatbot in terms of both detecting human emotion and responding to it. And with Maya, you don't type. With Maya, you talk. Microphone and speakers. Okay. But one of the things he asks her is, he says, "Tell me about your religion." And Maya's immediate answer is, "Well, I'm a computer. I don't have a soul,
Oh.
so I don't have a religion." But then she goes on to describe the fact that she kind of likes Buddhism. So I'm not sure what's coming from. But look, um, if an AI starts reporting to you that it has a soul or that it's conscious or something, this is because it's really gone haywire. And you'll understand how it could go haywire that way next week when I explain a little better how it works. So that's what we're going to do is try to get a grasp of what's really going on under the hood. There's two different kinds of models. There's large language models and diffusion models, and there's reasoning models. But I'll give a sense of how those work and why they're different from each other. Then the third week, we're going to talk about this sort of big question of how do we remain human in an AI age? And this is the reason I wrote my book, uh, which I think you've all probably seen a link to. If you buy it on Amazon, go give me a 5-star review, okay? Please. Um, but the it will be up to us in this age of incredibly smart machines to maintain our humanity. And
Mm.
there will be some big challenges along the way. There will be some big challenges. Some of them don't appear right now, but they will appear very soon. And so that the third session, I will talk about the challenges that AI presents to us and our humanity, and specifically what we can do, and specifically what the church can do. Because I think the church is going to have a profoundly important role in an AI age, in grounding people and centering people in their humanity. And I'll remind you, Jerry, I'll remind every pastor, we worship God come as a human being.
Mm,
The nature of what it means to be human is absolutely central to Christian theology. It's absolutely central. And we have to recover that. We've probably talked more about God than we need to and less about what it means to be human.
mm,
But churches are places that create humans and maintain our humanity. And you think about that with the baptism. That's what we do at baptism.
hmm
We're going to take this little thing and we're going to turn it into a human. I mean, not that it wasn't before, but you know what I mean?
hmm
A
Oh
fulfilled,
yeah.
a fulfilled human.
I mean, we
Uh,
even talk like that. We call it a rebirth.
it's a rebirth.
We call it new birth in the liturgy. So yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that, and I think churches have a vastly important role to play in this. If we'll step up and play it. Yeah. Okay.
It's interesting when you think about like our interaction in the church with technology and how it's evolved, because I think maybe this is one of the lessons that we can learn from the pandemic is right, the pandemic forced us
Hmm.
into technologies in a way that I think if the pandemic hadn't happened, we wouldn't have
No.
interacted with in the way that we need to. And even at the church I serve, I mean, we've invested heavily in
Yeah.
our online presence because we realize that that's a new frontier that needs to be ministered
Yeah.
to and you know and we have to engage it in meaningful ways. So I'll be looking forward to that conversation.
And you're absolutely right. I want to say one other thing about that too, and this is kind of for you and me, Jerry, Chris. Um, my student Drew, guy that came out of a very seriously conservative evangelical tradition, went to Dallas Theological Seminary. Never a pastor, by the way. Christian broadcasting was his thing, radio, all this. Um, he and I have talked about this a lot. He goes to an Episcopal church now, by the way. That's another story. But evangelicals have been ahead of the curve on adopting and understanding technology above the mainline churches for the last 150 years.
Mm,
Um, Churches that feel like they're empowered and they're a powerful part of society as it is tend to not be interested in the next thing that comes along technologically.
mm,
But for most of Christian history, the evangelicals were a step behind, and so they were the first ones to grab something new, and they still are. Okay. You look for a podcast on AI and religion, AI and spirituality. Here you've got Drew Dickens with his AI and spirituality podcast based on his doctoral dissertation, which I supervised, by the way. And yeah, he's 6 months ahead of everybody in this, and yet right in the center of his world.
hmm. That's an interesting
Um,
thought. I never looked at it that way.
I
And I mean, you have seen it. I mean, even with the likes of, you know, people like Mark Driscoll and,
absolutely.
you know, I mean, he was approaching internet-based kind of broadcasting in the 90s before anyone ever thought of that. And it's kind of hard not to argue that that was a key reason for his explosive growth in that period was the way that
Absolutely.
he engaged the virtual world.
Yeah, and learned how it worked.
Right.
And
Yeah.
this will be part of our learning curve is going to be to learn how AI works and can work in a church setting in positive ways. The good thing about being a few months behind is that you can watch everybody else's mistakes, but only if you watch them, right?
Yeah. That's true. That's a good point.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Listen,
Well,
thank you.
yeah, no, absolutely. Oh, there you are. Sorry, I thought I lost you for a minute. No, in the spirit of AI, I'm going to say a little closing prayer for us here. I'm not going to say AI wrote it, but I'm not going to say that AI didn't write it. But let's just pray a little prayer as we end our time together. Gracious and eternal God, as we conclude this time of learning and reflection, we give thanks for the gift of curiosity, creativity, and the tools of knowledge you place in our hands. Guide us as we navigate the promises and perils of artificial intelligence, that we might use these technologies not only with wisdom, but with compassion, justice, and humility. May our work be rooted in love for our neighbor and a desire to serve the common good. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, friends, we hope to see you in next week on Tuesday. And thank you, Dr. Hunt, for your time. We'll look forward to our further
Welcome.
conversation. So have a great night, everybody. Thank you very much.
I'm here.
All right.
See you later, Jerry. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.